Hi everyone, before we begin this episode, I've got a little favour to ask you. We'd love to hear a bit more about you and what you think of the Conversation Weekly. So we've launched a listener survey. It should just take a few minutes of your time and we'd really appreciate your thoughts. Thanks very much if you've already filled it in, but if you haven't, you can do so by clicking on the link in our show notes. Or if you're listening via our website, click on the link in the article that's associated with this podcast on the conversation. Okay, now on with the show.
British will come so off we go in the final event of the halftime.
I cannot wait for the Olympics to begin. If you're an Olympics fan like me, you may have a core Olympic memory. One event that you watched that you'll never forget. For me, it was Super Saturday at London 2012. It was a lovely sunny evening and I was at a friend's birthday party in their garden. But there were a few of us Team GB fans who kept popping inside to watch the telly. And we all watched together as Jessica Ennis-Hill won heptathlon gold. Then 20 minutes later, Greg Rutherford won the long jump. And then to top it all off, Mo Farah, one of the UK's greatest ever long-distance runners, raced home for gold in the 10,000 metres.
Mo Farah gritting his teeth now. The arms have got to pump, the knees have got to come up high. He's got to find something extra. He's got to kick hard. Come on, Mo Farah. Gabriel Maskell is coming, but I think he's going to get there. Farah is going to make it 2 gold medals for Great Britain. Beautiful.
It was joyous. I'm pretty sure I cried. And I was even more elated, it felt, because I'd watched it with other people, jumping up and down with them all in delight. As the Paris Olympics approach, it feels like we're in a peculiar moment in history. Multiple wars rage across the globe. Multiple elections around the world are revealing increasing polarisation and heightened political tensions. And yet, in the same moment, athletes from all over the world are gathering together to compete for gold. And millions of people across the globe will be tuning in to watch. Can something as simple as watching a sporting competition at the same time bring people closer together? Today we're exploring this question with a psychologist who studies the impact of shared experiences. I'm Gemma Ware and this is The Conversation Weekly, the world explained by experts. We're joined today by Senior Science Editor at The Conversation in the US, Maggie Villiger. Maggie, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks. Hi, Gemma.
So Maggie, we're talking today about this question of the psychology of shared experiences and thinking about how they can bring us together. It does seem, though, like with so much of what we watch being streamed, you can watch it whenever you want, people curating their own social media experiences, that the majority of the times when we watch things together with someone else now is actually sports, isn't it?
Totally. It's been in, the last decade or so, pretty much everything on TV is now streaming. Whereas not so long ago, people would be talking about what happened on a particular show the next day. I have explicit memories of talking about The Simpsons with other kids at school on Monday mornings, or talking about Mad Men with colleagues at work the next day. So even though you might have been at home watching all by yourself, part of the fun was knowing that everyone else was watching too. And then we could talk about it the next time we were together. Whereas now it's pretty much sports and maybe awards shows that are tied to a particular time and place. And you can even watch those on demand too. My family here in the US has been watching the Euros soccer tournament, as we would say here. And even some of those games, my kids will record and watch at a more convenient time.
That's a tricky thing to do, to not find out the score until you want to watch it. I just don't think I could. I want to know too much. It does feel, though, that for most of the time when we watch things, when we experience things, we're actually in silos. We're in our world. We want to do this at the moment. We want to do it. And I just wonder how good that is for society and the way we experience the world.
Yeah, I think that question is something that's on a lot of people's minds here in the United States currently. There's a lot of polarization just culturally at this moment. It's nothing new to disagree with your family members or your neighbors about politics or religion or whatever. But I think many Americans are feeling like you can experience a totally different reality based on what shows you do watch or what news you follow, who and what you let into your little bubble. We don't just have 3 channels anymore that everyone is tuning into. It's kind of weird to say when in some ways, we have such a global homogenized culture, but it can feel like there are fewer shared experiences for people to bond over.
And we're thinking today about what science can tell us about this. And that's why you're here. So tell us a bit about the scholar that you found who's doing some really interesting work on this.
Sure. I was intrigued when Garriy Shteynberg got in touch with me about his research. He's an associate professor of psychology at the University of Tennessee, and he and his colleagues have been studying what happens when you experience something along with other people as opposed to just by yourself. And part of what I found really interesting about Garriy is that as a child, he immigrated to the United States from the Soviet Union. Obviously, those are two places with very different cultures around the individual versus the collective. And it gives him an interesting perspective on these questions about what it means to experience something together.
Great. Thanks so much, Maggie, for coming on.
Thanks, Gemma.
When I reached out to Garriy to talk about his work on collective experiences, he told me his interest in this area began with an experience he'd had as a teenager, recently arrived in the US.
I remember the first time being taken by collective experiences, I think around the age of 13 or 14. And actually, it's odd because I wasn't the participant of the collective experience. I was sort of the target of it.
Garriy was 11 when he immigrated from the Soviet Union to San Antonio, Texas, in the United States. Soon after arriving, he was matched with a mentor.
His name was Emmanuel Herrera, and he was just working with these immigrant kids from Soviet Union. And he worked at the radio station. He did their events.
A couple of years later, Garriy found himself at the city's annual festival, Night in Old San Antonio, helping Emmanuel to organise the parade.
There are all these floats of these flowers and a big procession with lots of people standing by to watch it. And at the last moment, he was like, okay, and you're going on the float. So he just kind of pushed me on this float. And, I'm just this shy kid. I'm 13 years old. I speak the language, but not that well. Certainly do not want to be in front of other people. And I'm like, well, what do I do? What do I do on this float? Right? He's like, well, you just wave to people, right? You don't have to do anything but wave and smile. Like, all right. And I just remember this visceral experience of being on this float and all these people being joyous at my waving at them. And I was thinking, what happened here? Like a second ago, I was just this kid, right? Just like any other kid. And by virtue of being on this float, my wave means so much more here, right? My smile means so much more. It has much more impact. And I remember thinking, it's because for them, I am now a collective experience. Nothing really changed about me, per se. I was on stage, and I think from a third perspective, I looked at the power of collective experience. And now I try to do that in my lab. Like I put people in rooms where they have collective experiences.
In his lab at the University of Tennessee, Garriy runs experiments to explore whether there are any real-life consequences from having shared experiences.
Whether it has any effect on human thought, memory, affect, behavior. So, there's lots of logic, theory to suggest that they would be. But of course, as an experimental psychologist, you also want to see whether there's any data that suggests that there's something special about synchronous shared experiences.
Garriy and his team create situations where people can have a shared experience.
That could be just basic information, like a list of words. It could be an emotional scene, like a tearjerker of a video or a funny video or something like that. It could be goals that you give participants. You give participants all sorts of tasks where they take on the goal and you see how much they pursue that goal subsequently.
These tasks include things like memorizing a list of words or little games on the computer where letters pop up and participants must press a particular key each time they see a vowel.
So that's sort of like the key condition where we're trying to amp up this feeling of shared experience or shared attention.
These experiments also have control conditions.
Conditions which we're trying to take away that key ingredient of shared experience.
The most obvious control condition for this sort of study is to have just one participant alone in a room watching a video or doing a task on their own. But there are a few other ways to create control conditions.
So more interesting ones are not exactly when they're alone, but when they are together with other people, but those other people are not really co-attending with them. They might be attending elsewhere, or they might be attending after them or before them. So there's asynchrony in the experience. And those are the kind of conditions where, there's some shared experience, but it's diminished.
So, Garriy, what have you been finding in all these experiments?
The findings generally are that when we synchronously co-experience things, our experiences become amplified. So if we're co-experiencing a list of words, we have found that if I give you a surprise test after the fact, if you co-experience the list of words, you're better able to recall that list versus if you experience them alone. If we co-experienced an emotional scene, we find that people feel more emotional in a way that's consistent with the scene. So if it's a happy scene, people feel happier when they co-experience it versus experiencing alone or out of tune with others asynchronously. If it's a sad scene, people feel sadder. So it amplifies whatever that stimulus is. If we give people a task or a goal of some sort during the study, press the space bar when you see consonants and press the enter button when you see vowels or something silly like that, and they know that they're giving this task while others are also given this task, people tend to pursue it more vigorously, right? So they have more motivation to complete the task. So collective experience as being an amplifier of our thoughts.
And why is that happening? Is it something fundamental about being human? That this doing something together with someone else amplifies your experience?
I should have some humility here, and I do, that we don't ultimately always know why something is happening. But the theory is that amplification of what we see together creates a common language for us to use after the fact. Imagine yourself going to a museum with your friends. Some of the things you see at that museum, you co-experience. Some of the things you see alone. You exit the museum, right? What can you fruitfully talk about? The conversation is going to be much more fluid if you talk about the shared experiences. Even if you deeply disagree about those experiences. Even if you say, I hated the work of art. Oh, I love that work of art, right? You can still have the conversation. Not to say that, there's no value to the experiences you have by yourself. It's just there's less of a value in terms of our ability to interact with others and sort of build consensus.
Garriy, you describe your work as creating what you've called the theory of collective mind.
Yes, right.
It's a pretty heady term. So can you explain that for us? What is the collective mind?
Sure, yeah. So the idea of theory of mind is simply that humans often think about other people's mental states. This is how we function in society. This is how we do relationships. We guess or infer or imagine what our friend needs, what they're thinking about, and we try to accommodate or not, depending on your relationship. And we do the same thing with our professors and our coworkers, so on and so forth, right? And the virtue of having a theory of mind is trying to be able to look at the divergence between minds, right? I might have these needs, but you might have these other needs. I might see it this way, but you might see it another way, right? And that helps us navigate the social scene. What I study is the convergence. So the idea is that our individual minds do not only track where we diverge, but they also track where we converge with others.
So let's do a little thought experiment here. You're listening to this podcast. Maybe you're driving, you're doing the dishes, or you're out for a run. You're seeing the road, or feeling water on your skin, or the thud of your feet against the ground. These thoughts and experiences, Garriy explains, constitute your individual consciousness. The collective mind expands this.
When you create a collective mind, it's as if the perspective broadens, right? It becomes a we perspective. There's no longer a need to keep track of what Garriy might be thinking or seeing and what Gemma might be thinking or seeing, but rather you create a collective perspective within your cognitive space. So you start thinking to yourself, we are seeing this, we are feeling this, we want to do this, right? So that's the theory of collective mind, where by tracking convergence between different minds, you create a collective perspective. And then the question is, well, why would people do this? What is the point of having a collective perspective?
To answer this question, Garriy says you need to start by considering why we have individual perspectives.
When you have an individual perspective and you know what you are seeing and what you are wanting, you can then take action on behalf of that whole organism. And you coordinate your entire body and psychology in that pursuit of the entire individual organism. The same is true when you have a collective perspective, right? When you think to yourself, we are seeing this, we are planning that, we are doing this, the actions that flow from that sort of theory of collective mind are for the benefit of the collective organism.
I mean, I'm just thinking of the Borg as you're talking to me.
Right.
For those of you who aren't closet Trekkies like me, the Borg is a group of cyborgs linked in an alien hive mind called the Collective. They're one of the recurring bad guys in the fictional Star Trek universe.
I love the Borg as an analogy for this. This is sort of like the immigrant kid speaking as well, because, I come from a culture where collective consciousness is front and center. It's explicit, right? In Soviet Union, collective consciousness was emphasized all the time. In the United States, it's quite the opposite. Most of the time, collective consciousness, collective perspective is something to be afraid of. It is something that's put in the background, right? You want individual consciousness, individual reasoning. Both of those outlooks are mistaken in a way because, we have both. We both have thoughts and perspectives from an I point, from an individual perspective, and simultaneously we have collective ones. And these are not really in competition. That's the other thing that the Borg really get wrong, because Borg are really made from an American perspective. It's like, if you're a Borg, then you're not an individual. And if you're an individual, then you're not Borg. They're always juxtaposed as the opposites. I think the reality is that they're always working together. They're always co-present. My conception of what our goal is during any interaction is really important for then organizing my own individual thoughts and what I can do in this space as an individual.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't think it's like the Borg for that reason. The I doesn't go away.
I love it. I love that it's not the Borg.
The Borg has got it along, yeah.
Yeah, Star Trek got it wrong. Sorry, fellow Trekkies. We're at this moment, particularly in the US, but not just, but globally, of the deep political polarization. And you've argued that collective experiences are one of the things that's left behind, that's still there when public trust, political consensus disappear. People cannot agree on anything. What role do you think that collective experiences play there, and what role can they have in trying to bridge divides between people?
What I've seen out there is this supposition that if we don't share ideology, if we don't share beliefs, if we don't share identity, there's nothing between us. There's no bridge to get from one shore to another. In my research, I've tried to study, and theorize about a way in which people are connected that is not always obvious. That shared experiences kind of form this minimal social connection that doesn't require us to share identities, ideologies, or even beliefs. And these are, in a sense, they're implicit, they're in the background, but they're really important. The idea that we are in the same room together, that we might be watching the same news or whatever it is an important social bridge upon which things can be built.
Now, this doesn't mean that shared experiences will automatically lead to political consensus.
The extent to which shared experiences can bridge political divides. It is a tricky topic because, of course, shared experiences can also create political divides. If you and I start talking about things we disagree about, then we'll feel more distant from one another rather than closer to one another. We'll have a shared experience of our deep ideological divide.
But Garriy, there might be some instances where people have very different collective memories of the same event. So take the US election in 2020 for an example. People on different sides of the political divide in the US, Republicans, Democrats, remember that event very differently, think very differently about the outcome and what happened next. So how does that all fit together?
Part of the issue there is the sense that we don't only disagree about our values or beliefs in respect to that election, but we disagree about the basic facts of what happened. And that is quite disturbing because at some point, shared experiences do disintegrate. If we can't agree on what we're observing whatsoever, then there's no we to speak of. There's only I and my reality and you and your reality. But I also think we're very far from that. I think in terms of particular issues, it is true that we can see different realities. But in many different ways, we believe we share a basic shared experience of how we live, work, and play, Olympics being a good example of that. I think the focus being on the deep division, and that always being front and center of our shared experience, obscures the fact that we are in fact of collective mind to a great number of things.
So the fact that everyone's saying, oh, we're deeply polarized, and someone on either side of the political debate know that, and they say, oh, but you're polarized from me and I'm polarized from you, that kind of shapes our collective experience of each other. Is that what you're saying?
Well, yeah, our collective experience is one polarization, exactly. There's just a lot more to us than our political divisions. There's also this sense, which, I'm not a historian, but it does seem to have grown in the last century, that disagreement in values means that we have to disengage completely, that we should withdraw into our respective corners, that we should not work through it, we should not resolve it, that each of us is entirely defined on this one particular issue.
Yeah. One of the things that you could argue is that there are actually fewer shared experiences since media has become much more on demand. We don't sit down and all watch television at the same time each night. We watch it when we want to, or we watch movies on streaming platforms, and we listen to what music we want to listen to. Is there just a kind of a general diminishing of shared experiences in the 21st century?
Yeah, it kind of depends how you look at it, right? You could say there's diminishment of large-scale collective experiences. Of the sort of Olympics, for example, is a large-scale international global event, right? But there's a proliferation of really small-scale, niche shared experiences, where each of us, through YouTube, social media, etc., is cultivating sort of these media-mediated shared experiences with others that tend to diverge from one another. So yeah, I would say that large-scale shared experiences have gone down, that we don't have the sense that we're really consuming the same news nationally as we did maybe in the 1960s, right? But I think more than ever, you have sort of identity-bound shared experiences in today's media, where you log in to your particular Twitter stream and you see what everybody who thinks like you says. So you're having a shared experience there.
It's not possible to turn the clock back, to move towards having more scheduled and less on-demand television. But Garriy says that something can be done about the media diet itself.
What I emphasize when I speak about this in terms of media consumption is creating media and consuming media that is for people of many different persuasions, right? That is not targeted so sharply towards one ideological point of view. And, in those kind of media landscapes, people are more likely to co-experience things with others that have different beliefs. And small-scale social interaction with people across the spectrum is really important. We're just much more complicated and diverse as individuals than one particular view, one particular belief.
Thank you so much, Garriy. It's been fascinating talking with you and understanding a bit more about this phenomenon that we all experience but perhaps don't think about enough. So thank you.
Thank you, Gemma.
That's it for today's show. Thanks to Maggie Villiger of The Conversation in the US, who we heard from at the top of the episode. We'll pop a link in our show notes to an article that Garriy wrote for The Conversation, and some other suggested reading too. This episode was written and produced by Katie Flood, with production assistance from Mend Marawani. Sound design was by Eloise Stevens, and our theme music is by Nita Saul. Stephen Kahn is our global executive editor, and I'm Gemma Ware, the show's executive producer. You can connect with us on Instagram at theconversation.com or email us directly at podcast@theconversation.com. Do sign up for The Conversation's free daily newsletter by clicking on the link in our show notes. If you like what we do, please support our podcast and The Conversation more broadly by going to donate.theconversation.com. And please also rate and review the show wherever you listen, especially on Spotify, where you can answer a Q&A about what you thought of the episode. It really helps us reach a wider audience. Thanks so much for listening.